Today I'm going to be talking about what you see here on the screen, culture and context. More specifically, the value as researchers of understanding culture and context in order to develop more compelling ideas, more meaningful ideas. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today is because I sense there's an obsession with closeness and depth in our industry, in research. Ethnographic immersion and really understanding the individual. And that's okay. But I think a lot of the times we forget that a lot of the most interesting insights actually lie in the person's context or is in macro factors, in societal, cultural insights. And so hopefully if I get something out of this talk today, I would like to, not for you to abandon the idea of empathy and closeness and depth, but to have a bigger appreciation of looking at context, not just looking close and deep, but looking wide and sideways and broad. And then hopefully I can help you get closer to the seat at the table, as Yoel said. Okay, so a little bit about Nation, our company. So Nation, actually I don't have imposter syndrome. I'm actually an imposter myself. I'm a qualitative researcher by training, and so I come actually from a brand and communication research background. And our company accidentally, actually over time, fell into design research because we were specialized in foundational research and what we call exploratory research. So the kind of briefs that we get are around market entry, new product development, concept development from scratch, or it can be brand strategy, or if it's creative development, it would be at communication, campaign idea development. So less testing, more development, and very upstream, early stage kind of briefs. And so the emphasis of that, the expectation of our clients tend to be for us to come up with meaningful ideas, meaningful and distinctive ideas, as opposed to renovation or improvements. We have to come up with ideas. And therefore, that makes us absolutely obsessed about two things. When you have to come up with meaningful and impactful, distinctive ideas, really what we look for is two things. It's motivation and meaning. I guess this is kind of what we bring into design research from my background in brand research, is that you don't necessarily rely on what people say and what they do, but obviously you want to understand motivation, why people do things, why they think things, what lies in their mind and in their hearts. But we also preoccupied with what objects mean in the context of their life, what their ideals or mental models, where that comes from a cultural, societal point of view. So again, when we, and I'll give you more examples of this later on so it makes sense here. But it's not just about motivation and behavior, but we also look at meaning as well. So in a sense, with that in mind, empathy is a bit overrated. Obviously, that's not really true. But what I'm saying, and I kind of wanted to get your attention, because I know where there's so much emphasis on empathy in our industry, is that empathy, when only thought about as user experience, as only closeness and depth, I feel is a bit overrated. And I've been in this industry and research for probably about 15 years, and it's the same with market research. Everybody was obsessed about depth. Every brief from a market research client, I want deep insights. Can you go deep into understanding this and that? And actually, there was such an obsession with depth, as if all the answers to a brand lied in some mysterious place in the subconscious. And therefore, researchers were trained in projective techniques and laddering techniques and so forth. And we forgot about looking around a person's house or walking around their neighborhood. This is what I mean by empathy is overrated. At least empathy as it is currently interpreted and thought about. We need to be careful because it's only half of empathy that probably a lot of us might be doing. Why is context and culture as part of empathy really important? Because you live in Indonesia and you live in Southeast Asia, where it's what we call a high context society. It's a collective culture where people, and I've done research in Europe, in Australia and so forth, and you do research there, you speak to people, a lot of the things that people do and think here are not necessarily driven by a conscious desire, an individual motivation. Often it's driven by their context or what society has decided as being true or false or bad or good or ugly or beautiful. And this is much more true for collective cultures like Indonesia. So if I have to put weight in terms of how do you empathize with an Indonesian as opposed to someone from the Western world, I would put more emphasis in understanding their context for sure, because you will not be able to empathize with an Indonesian if you only listen to what they say. They won't be able to articulate everything. And I'll give you some really good examples of that where we actually saw that in our research. And so again, I was reading I just recently bought another book on design thinking, and a really good book, but actually they had a chapter on empathy and how to do empathy. And I felt it quite pressurizing because basically the book was saying we have to practice mindfulness and to be able to neutralize our mind and to be able almost to feel and almost have sixth sense. So I felt like, is this empathy or telepathy? Like, I don't really believe in that. Of course, you have to feel, you have to spend time with people and try to empathize, but we cannot just rely on that. And I actually have what I feel is much more effective is actually more complete definition of empathy is to empathize is to understand a person's frame of reference, right? And so when a person tells you, when you observe a frustration or a tension, or when they say, I like this, I don't like this, I do this, then we have to understand their frame of reference. Where is that coming from? And you'll be better able to understand that response or that reflex through understanding their context. And again, I call this often understanding culture. It's driven not by necessarily a psychological motivation, but almost their cultural subconscious. I try to visualize what we mean by context and culture, and these are kind of the layers in which we tend to look at. So when you say you're going into field work and you're meeting someone and you're studying a topic, so you won't find this in book. I kind of made this up just to help us really understand how we kind of go about understanding the layers to a specific topic. So the private and intimate is the psychology of this person, and you try to understand. Often we start off by what the motivations, the desire for status, the desire to stand out, the desire for togetherness, and so forth. And that drives behavior. And the behavior, what you see, what they do, what they consume, is often a manifestation of what's in their mind and their heart. So what I was saying earlier, we tend to focus empathy, I feel, on the blue part only often, and we often forget that the behavior is often a consequence of their physical environment or of their social environment or of culture. And so what I want to do today in the rest of my presentation is show you some examples of how we can understand behavior and influence behavior through an understanding of the outer layers. Through some examples of the work we've done. It's not to say that we should disregard the private and intimate and behavioral insight. They're absolutely critical, but I would encourage you to spend more time in looking into the outer layers, which is the contextual and the cultural. So again, in design research, I would encourage you to combine empathy and context. So closeness and context. So if you're going to the kampungs to understand how people use technology, for example, don't just spend 3 hours in their home, walk around their neighborhood, understand how information is consumed in schools. If you're studying food, for example, don't just look at what's in their kitchen, but speak to stakeholders or influencers within their neighborhood who look at collective cooking rituals. What does food at schools look like? And often that's where you find much more interesting insights. And I would spend probably 3 hours in their home and 3 hours in the context as opposed to 3 days, following someone around in their home. You probably get a lot less just through closeness. So similarly, in brand research, let's not just do in-depth interviews or focus groups. It's great that you can do projective techniques. It's great that you can use imagery to do kind of third-person techniques, go into the subconscious, use psychological, psychoanalytical tools. But often, mind is K-pop image. So I wanted to give an example. Often, we do a lot of work for the likes of Shiseido and L'Oreal and for beauty products. And actually, when you do brand research, to help you understand why people buy Pond's or Lux or Citra and so forth, you will get a lot more by understanding their cultural references on beauty ideals, as opposed to them just telling you, oh, saya sukanya cantik, putih, merona, blah, blah, blah. Where does that come from? What does that look like? And it's very difficult to then provide guidance to our client in terms of how to articulate the brand and how to bring it to life if you only rely on what people say. So often what we do is we look at cultural representations of those themes. If you're working on beer, it's often about masculinity. You would look at representations of masculinity in advertising, in popular culture, in film, in magazines. Similarly so it can be around different topics. If you're working on food and want to understand better taste, then don't just ask a person what they think is good taste, but look at how taste is talked about in cooking books by food bloggers and so forth. Big impactful ideas, believe it or not, often lie in the things that people don't say or don't reveal to you or don't show through their behavior, but it's very often, not primarily, in their context and culture. So what I want to do now is make it more tangible, hopefully, for you. To give you some examples of work that we've done. So what is context? So context, if you look it up, is defined as the circumstances or the setting in which a product is used. And often you'll find the meaning of that product to that person by understanding the context in which it's used. So the physical environment, is it used in the living room, or is it used in the bedroom, or is it used in front of others? Is it used as part of social activities? Is it used alone? And that applies for everything from whiskey to apps. It's really important to understand the physical and the social environment in which the product is used, because that defines the meaning of that product. An example, we do a lot of work with Google, actually, and one of their big goals is to drive penetration of search in what they call NBU users, so next billion user, which tend to be second and third tier cities. So we've done a lot of work in rural areas looking at how people consume information. And if you go, so this lady right here is one of our respondents. We actually asked her to do a Google search for the very first time, and she just froze. She was almost paralyzed. It was very difficult for her to, the actual use case was, we asked her, what do you want to search online? Oh, my daughter had fever. I want to know about fever medication. And so, can you search fever medication? Basically, she did a voice search, and what she said, oh, my daughter had fever yesterday. I already gave her this, but then this doesn't work. What else should I use? And so you and I would just go fever medication children, right? So this idea of syntax search is actually impossible. What do you do with that kind of insight? And so we had to understand, why is this happening? And what we realized, actually, by looking at her context, is that her house was completely absent of text. There were no books, no magazines, nothing, not even a calendar. Everything was verbal and visual. So articulating in words was very difficult. Another thing that we understood is we went to the school and we realized that actually computer technology, in her days when she was at school, she never touched a computer. Her children have touched a computer, and therefore she went straight from a telephone to a smartphone. So no wonder she's only using WhatsApp, nothing else. Because you need computer technology. I guess the smartphone is closer to a computer than it is to a telephone. And we only got that by visiting the school, by looking at her house, by understanding how she consumed information. We also did a diary on how she consumed information. So we asked her to whisper in a tape recorder every time she was looking for information. And a lot of it was asking a neighbor, or a lot of it was through conversations or through the TV. Which led to innovation ideas in the form of Google Go, so which is more visual way of extracting information. And now Google is really pushing the Assistant, which is much more similar to asking a neighbor. So it kind of humanizes information search, which is absolutely... Google Assistant wasn't developed for this audience. It was developed to be your secretary, basically, if you're an urban inhabitant. But then it turned out to be really helpful in humanizing search. That's one example. Another example, we had a consumer goods client tell us, give us a brief around wanting to better serve santri, Islamic boarding schools, because apparently there's many of them, there's a lot of santri, and they have shops inside their schools. And so there's an opportunity to serve them with snacks, with soap, etc. One of the things that we saw, we heard in the interviews, is that they were buying a lot of like super cheap sachets daily. They had to go to the store every single day, when actually they had a monthly allowance from their parents. But they were buying very cheap sachets, single serve everything. And it wasn't because they couldn't afford to buy bottles or bigger SKUs or bigger products. what we realized is when we went into their bathrooms, their washing quarters, etc., one is a very collective culture, so they share everything. And secondly, you've got 100 students lining up to go to maybe 8 shower booths. And so what happened, they have these gayung. You know what gayung is? It's that thing there. Where they put everything from the detergent to the toothpaste to everything. And so the pesantren shower ritual is to line up to queue your gayung rather than physically queue. And when someone showers, then you take your gayung, you go into the shower and so forth. And so what happens, there's a lot of mixing up. Somebody takes the wrong red gayung, or they drop something, somebody takes your shampoo and so forth. And so that was the big insight. It was a contextual insight rather than something that people said. If we only led from, I only buy sachet because it's cheap and it's practical, it doesn't tell you much. But we only found out that the real reason they were using single-serve sachets was because it was risk-free, meaning you could lose it and it was fine, or you could easily share it with someone else. So that's another contextual insight that we found by looking into the context of the product and how it was used. And another example for context is we did some work recently for a streaming service. It was a music streaming service. And they found something really interesting in Indonesia is that they make money from premium subscriptions, monthly subscriptions. But funnily enough, in Indonesia, there was a disproportionate amount of people who buy daily and weekly subscriptions. And it's not just daily and weekly, because the daily and weekly is meant to, you upgrade to monthly, but people were buying 5 weeks in a row or 7 days in a row, which to the client made absolute no sense at all, because it becomes more expensive than buying the monthly. Actually, they were really confused, even the local client, and actually what we did, we looked broad, we look into adjacent categories, and you see in Indonesia, actually, you buy single serve or small portions for everything. You can buy 1 cigarette ngeteng di warung. We can even now buy just a week of electricity. We can also buy everything from shampoo and so forth in single serve. So it is a sachet mindset. And where does that sachet mindset come from? So our client was from Scandinavia, and it made no sense. To them, value for a housewife is buying a 2-liter detergent. Value for a housewife in Indonesia, being cautious, is buying 1 sachet per day. And it's a very different mindset, and you can only understand that through our context, because 60% of Indonesians are in the gray employment, meaning there's no income security. So even if you earn 5 million a month, you might not know if you're going to earn it again next month. And so that leads to a much more cautious approach to finances, where cash flow comes first, and you want to hold on to money. Although consistently, if you look at your pattern, you generally have money, but that's one of the things that leads people to the sachets were made for low-income users, but now we even see middle-class, higher-income users still buy in small portions, much more so than in the West. Again, we got that through the context. So a few tips on how do you do context. Well, if you're studying something, whether it's a consumer good or a technology or an app, meet the person in their home, spend time with them, speak to them, empathize, practice mindfulness, but also you look at where they're using it. Snoop around their home. Indonesians tend to be quite comfortable with that. Go into their kitchen, open their pantry, look at where things are kept, etc. We do a lot of social kind of interviews, cross-generational interviews, where we interview the person and their mother, or friendship groups, or we could do a community group where in villages, for example, where the social dynamic is very important. You have the household, their neighbor, the community leader, and so forth in the same group. So often it's really useful to do these kind of more contextual methodologies. So that's context. So hopefully you have some learnings from them, and feel free to ask me questions after this. I'm now going to give you some examples of culture. So what do I mean by culture? So culture is not museum macan. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not fine art. It's not... when we talk about culture in research, it's the shared ideas, the shared beliefs, the shared tensions and desires in society. And it's listening to what your user or your consumer is saying and trying to understand what are the bigger narratives, or how does this desire represented in society. Let me give you some examples of this. A bit more of a fun project. We did some work for a super premium whiskey. And they had done research before, and their previous agency had said, oh, super premium whiskey is driven by a need for status. And then the third one is when we saw multiple men who were on an equal level, but we call it among kings because they were enjoying a very expensive bottle together. And we call that among kings because there's no power dynamic where I'm higher and you're lower. But the power dynamic was with the next table. So we are kings and you're not kings. And I'm sure you'll see these dynamics all the time wherever in the world. But actually, then we were able to find much richer insight when we pulled it back into the historical cultural roots of these behaviors, of these power dynamics, because in Indonesia you have something called Bapaism, which is fatherism. And you see that in the corporate world where you've got the boardroom table and you've got like the big boss and everybody is kind of bowing down. And you see that same dynamic in the bar. We have another culture called upeti. And the worst is basically making an offering to someone. And we've been doing it for hundreds of years where one kingdom gave a stronger kingdom a bribe, basically. And in the worst case is corruption in Indonesia, but it can be the hamper that you give to a client. But there is this culture of upeti. And in upeti, there's a clear rule, and that the more expensive the cookies you give, the more respectful you are towards your client, right? And it's the same thing in these dynamics. So we got a lot of rich insights from that. And then finally, among kings, Indonesia has a long history of what we call the Priai brothers, from Abu Rizal Bakri brothers to like the nation's founders, Sukarno, Hatta, and so forth. It was basically a gang of like successful men. And we recreate that narrative constantly in bars when you're with your buddies and you want to look successful after on a Friday night. So we saw that narrative. This helped us by finding the cultural roots. We understood the cultural subconscious that was leading to that. And it helped the client develop rituals, the waiter scripts, how we serve the bottle, how we serve, even pouring the drinks and so forth, building from these three narratives, which was a lot richer than just telling the client it's status-driven. What does that actually mean? We were asked by Aqua, which is a big mineral water company. They wanted to redesign their Aqua Glass pack. And similarly here, Aqua Glass is mainly used for what we call premium hosting. But premium hosting is like the head of the village or the Pak RT is coming to your house and you serve them with a drink. It's usually a red syrup or tea or a plastic cup of water. And so they wanted to understand the codes of Nyuguhin in order to be able to inspire the development of pack design. And so what we did, we snooped around people's houses. We looked at the semiotic codes, the aesthetics of glassware. And you can see there from the really tacky to the quite kind of Scandinavian, clean, white-looking glassware. So we used that as aesthetic rules. We also looked at articles online, etika menjamu and stuff like that. How do you serve a customer? One of the key insights was that it's not cool to ask your guest to have to punch the straw because it's really messy and it's aggressive. And that was one of the ritual of menjamu is very delicate. It's very soft. And so if you give that and you punch it's almost like it changes the dynamic, it ruins the mood. So we found a lot of things just by looking at the ethics of menjamu. In the end, I don't think they've launched it yet, but hopefully it'll come out soon. And the final one, which is, I was talking about masculinity, so we did some work on beer. So we do a lot of alcohol work, thankfully. We did some work for Bintang in Timor-Leste, in East Timor. And they have a really interesting, so beer is always about masculinity and strength. Wherever you go, and it's about togetherness, but it's in some form about masculinity. And so also here, we were listening to what people, trying to understand what people were saying about why they drink Heineken over Bintang over something else. But really, what we really found most profound in our insights in developing a brand strategy was when you looked at masculine ideals in Timor. And it's really very interesting because in the last 30, 40 years, their masculine ideals have shifted very, very quickly, even less than one generation, because they were at war. And so the masculine ideals in their big brothers or big cousins was still the guerrilla fighter. But now this generation, because it's a time of peace, it's more of an adventurous urban masculine ideal. And usually you don't see these shifts move very quickly. And no wonder actually the clients saw a big movements from very aggressive masculine brands to softer kind of party brands. which kind of explained it. When you see a shift in masculine ideals, you see a direct shift in consumption of brands, because especially for brands that are very expressive, where they kind of taste the same, but it's all about image. So yeah, culture. How do you incorporate an understanding of culture in your research? A few things you can do. You can ask your respondents to do what we call a media or consumption diary. So after you do an interview, you can tell them, for the next 5 days, can you share everything from your Facebook timeline, Instagram, that represent the masculine ideal in your head, for example. So what do you hear, what do you read, what do you see around masculinity, for example. You can do interviews with experts, but we call them thinkers as opposed to makers. So people who think about abstract things, academics, journalists, interview the editor of FHM, for example, if you're talking about masculinity, and so forth. You can do what we call semiotics, which is looking at the meaning of symbols, but you have to have a semiotician for that. Or you can do literature review. And literature review is not necessarily academic papers all the time. It can be like we did. You just Google etika menjamu, the ethics of hosting. And you find lots of, I would prioritize popular culture over academic literature. Empathy, remember, it is definitely to feel what another person is experiencing, but don't worry, you don't have to have sixth sense. Of course you have to feel, of course you have to be present and try to bring neutrality in your mind and to be able to understand, but empathy really happens when you understand their frame of reference. And for you to understand when a person tells you, I'm frustrated and so forth, it only makes sense when you understand the context of the product, where it's used, how it's used, with whom it's used, and also it can be more symbolic things like culture. So if there's one thing that you can do after this, always remember to zoom in and then zoom out, zoom in and then zoom out. And if you do that in your analysis, I promise you, you are more likely to come up with more meaningful and better ideas. That's it.
Buka aja Bukalapak.